Welcome to our second episode of One Work, 5 Questions with Dr. M. Andrew Holowchak and your host, Donna Vitek. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Holowchak.
Well, thank you for having me, Donna.
You're welcome. It's our pleasure. Dr. Holowchak is a retired professor of philosophy and history who has taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, and Rutgers University. He's a Thomas Jefferson scholar and has studied the works of Thomas Jefferson for over a decade. He has written over 100 essays and has over 20 published books on Thomas Jefferson. His list of books and locations of his published essays can be found in the description of the video. With One Work, 5 Questions, I'll ask Dr. Holowchak 5 questions on one work of Thomas Jefferson's. Our second topic today is Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Establishing Religious Freedom. Now let's get started.
All right.
For a little bit of background on Thomas Jefferson's Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom, the year 1776 is especially significant for Jefferson. After the death of his mother, he returns to the Continental Congress and takes up several significant projects. First, he begins and completes a draft constitution for Virginia. Next, he shuts himself into the second floor of a building at 7th and Market Streets and works on his draft of Declaration of Independence from June 11th to June 28th. Finally, early in November 1776, Jefferson gets leave from Virginia's House of Delegates to begin work as part of a 5-man committee on revising the outdated laws of Virginia. The committee would quickly be reduced to 3 men, Jefferson, George Wythe, and Edmund Pendleton. And the 3, with Jefferson's likely taking on the lion's share of the work, would draft 126 bills in an effort to republicanize the laws. Bill 82, Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom, was drafted by Jefferson and proposed to the Virginia Assembly of James Madison and finally passed late in 1786 while Jefferson was in France. So let's get started with question number 1.
All right.
Jefferson's Bill 82 is short, only 797 words, and yet he devotes over 600 words to his proem. Why such a lengthy introduction?
Yeah, there are, as you said, the lion's share of the bill is sort of an introductory passage. He includes 15 that's, and each that is a sort of reason for why the bill needs to be passed in the first place. A sort of defense of religious liberty, as it were. Now, those, like I said, are about 15 points that Jefferson wishes to underscore on the value of religious liberty. Some are naturalistic, some are, most of them are political. And he, of course, as is his wont, appeals to natural rights. And when he does so, that's to undermine the sort of Hobbesian view that the king by nature is God's true spokesperson or representative, that God speaks through the king. And Jefferson, of course, with his trying to republicanize political matters, wants to empower the people. So he's sort of trying to get rid of that view. Now, one might say the bill is one thing, but to pass the bill, one needs to give reasons for its significance, hence the lengthy proem. That's why the proem is so long.
Oh, okay. Okay. Question number 2, since he wanted us to focus on the proem, what is the first thing that sticks out in it?
That's a rather intriguing question. Here we can give listeners something that they have never gotten before. Let me read the first sentence here. It says, well aware that the opinions and belief of men depend not on their own will, but follow involuntarily the evidence proposed to their minds. That's the first that. Now, no one's ever picked up on this, and this is really an instance of Jefferson's Stoic epistemology. What Jefferson is committed to, he talks about that our opinions and belief are not a matter of our will. In other words, in some cases, at least he's trying to get at, we don't even choose the things which we believe. It's a matter of the mind involuntarily assenting to certain things. And that's a very Stoic sentiment. And And I've been on record in several publications claiming that Jefferson was a Stoic in essence, where he, in a letter to William Short, denies that. He emphatically denies that he was a Stoic, but he wasn't. He really was a Stoic. And I'll give you a couple quotes. Sextus Empiricus, who gives us an account of the Stoics, talks about the Stoics had something called the cataleptic impression. By that they mean there's certain of our sensory impressions that are just so manifestly vivid that they are true, and we can't deny them. The notion that I'm holding my hand up in front of my face is one such cataleptic impression. And Sextus says that this impression all but seizes us by the hair and pulls us to a sense. So in other words, looking at my hand, it's not up to me to say, okay, that this could be true or false. I can only assert that it's true. Cicero, in his book Academica, writes, and I quote, and he's talking about Chrysippus, the Stoics' view of the cataleptic impression. He says, just as a scale must sink when weights are placed in the balance, so the mind must give way to clear presentations. Just as no animal can refrain from seeking what appears suited to its nature, what the Greeks called oikeon, so the mind cannot refrain from assenting to a clear object. So if it's not too confusing, at least it's extraordinary to me that Jefferson begins this passage with a sort of appeal to Stoic epistemology. Say, okay, that, to make it understandable, the things of which I'm going to talk, I want to start off by saying some things are just obviously true. And the will, it's not even a matter of us willing to say this could be true or false. We can only will, the will is forced in effect. We can only will that something is true. So that's what really sticks out to me to start right off the bat, the first sentence.
Okay. Question number 3. Following up on that bit of Stoicism at the start, Jefferson gives us a psychology lesson by giving us some thoughts on the nature of the human mind. Do you have anything to say on that?
Well, sure. So right off the bat, piggybacking on top of this Stoic sentiment with which he begins, he comes to a couple claims. The Almighty God has created the mind free and manifested his supreme will that free it shall remain by making it altogether insusceptible of restraint. And I'll read the other, this is that number 3. All attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burthens, this is an old way of saying burdens, or by civil incapacitations tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who being Lord both of body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as was his almighty power to do, but to extend it by its influence on reason alone. So what we have here is a commitment to open and free discussion on religious issues, something to which he turns and expatiates on in query 17 of his notes on Virginia. So we have a commitment to the mind by nature, by God's creation being something free. And I can't iterate or reiterate often enough Jefferson's commitment to liberty. God had made the mind free. It's insusceptible of restraint. So any sort of temporal punishments, burdens, or civil incapacitations, as he calls them, are bootless. They lead to hypocrisy. They don't lead to what you want. Trying to force someone to believe something to be true against a person's will is impossible. God made the mind free and not susceptible to coercion. And the last thing, of course, is that reason alone is the proper influence of the mind. It might seem a rather strong commitment to rationalism, given the sort of intellectual climate in which we find ourselves today, with critical race theory and everything, and people trying to impose a sort of agenda of belief on us. But that's what Jefferson thought.
Right, and I think I'd like to piggyback on that. He even speaks in his bill about not even forcing people to contribute money to their own religious beliefs. It's a matter of not forcing people, allowing people the freedom to contribute to what they wish to contribute to, not forcing it.
And if they wish to, I think that's
right. Right, having that freedom, it not being a law or being persecuted for not doing it, and that's so important to not.
It's a point people miss out when it comes to charity. And when I was at one institution, I think Kutztown University, was teaching there for several years, and they had donations. There were voluntary donations by people in faculty to a particular charitable fund, and a rather good fund, by the way. And they were asking people voluntarily to donate a certain small percentage of their annual income to the charity. And it's a good cause, but when you're sort of asking in a very persuasive way, it really fails to be charity. And that's Jefferson's point in many respects, is that charity has to be an act of the will, and a free act of the will. It can't be done by coercion.
Right. And that's what's important. I'm so grateful that he stood up for our rights to do that. Question number 4. Jefferson quickly turns in his poem to the religious tyranny that prevailed in his day, the Anglicanism that colonists were forced to support. What sort of punishments did people suffer for their non-Anglicanism, and were citizens jailed for their religious beliefs?
Well, this is Jefferson once again, keeping good track of what has gone on in Virginian history. And I appeal to query 17 of his notes on Virginia. This is not in his bill. So to answer the question, I do have to go beyond the text, unfortunately. And I can give you an example just by reading. He says in 1705, there are some examples of the laws that existed in the punitions that could be imposed upon citizenry. If a person brought up in the Christian religion denies the being of a God or the Trinity, and Jefferson was very much opposed to Trinitarianism, thought it made no sense, or asserts that there are more gods than one, or denies the Christian religion to be true, or the scriptures to be of divine authority, he's punishable on the first offense by incapacity to hold any office or employment, ecclesiastical, civil, or military. On the second offense, by disability to sue, to take any gift or legacy. In other words, if an inheritance comes his way, he's not going to be able to get it. To be guardian, executor, or administrator, and by 3 years imprisonment without bail. And he says a father's right to the custody of his own children being founded in law on his right of guardianship, this being taken away, they may of course be severed from him and put by the authority of court into more orthodox hands. So there was imprisonment, there was the loss of money when a parent or so dies, there was separation from your own children. So there was great intrusion of religious views into the lives of ordinary Virginians from the Anglican Church. That was the church. Everybody was paying money to the Anglican Church, willingly or not willingly, and Jefferson wanted that to stop. So there were certain definite punishments that people could suffer.
Okay. And the last question, question number 5. Once again, Jefferson speaks of protecting civil liberties from persecution due to religious beliefs. Did he actually want a separation of church and state, or was he trying to provide financial and civil protection of the citizens' religious beliefs?
That's a tough question. It's a question that divides scholars. I think it's the latter mostly. So the question is that, and this is a question I'm not going to answer here completely, because I think it takes us to his letter to the Danbury Baptists, which is a separate issue. In other words, is the wall of separation to which he alludes in that letter Is it a two-way wall that separates, that wants to protect the individuals and also wants to protect the political institutions? The long and short of it here is Jefferson's focus is more on protecting the individuals than worrying about protecting the political institutions. So I think in some measure, it might be said to be trying to protect both. Now, let's go back to when we get away from the poem, let's go back to section 2, where he gets away from justifying the bill. And he says, we, the General Assembly of Virginia, do enact that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship place or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burthened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions and belief, but that all men shall be free to profess by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacity. So clearly we have a commitment towards protection of the individuals so that the individuals don't suffer punishments, political punishments, civil punishments for their own unique religious views. And in the body of the poem as well. So I'm pushing towards the latter here, at least, and this is a more complex question than I can answer, really. But at least in this bill, he seems to be wanting to protect individuals more than worry about political institutions. And you notice in the body of the poem, he says the opinions of men, are more important. Opinions of men are not the object of civil government. So in other words, if a person wants to participate in civil government, whatever opinions he has that are of a religious nature have no bearing on his capacity to fulfill his role in the civil government. He says also that each has, as you mentioned in your question, the freedom to give to the church of his choice. No one should be free to give to a church in which he does not believe. And that was going on with Anglicanism. Now you notice, of course, once we have the American Revolution, the Anglican Church of necessity is going to die off quite quickly because it's the official religion of the British government. And with the war with England going on, other religions are going to be much more popular. Jefferson, I'll make a few more points. Jefferson says that our civil rights, going back to individual rights, have no dependence on religious opinions, whether I am a Presbyterian, whatever my religious persuasion, it's no measure of my rights. Just like racial issues, so Jefferson says that, one's race has nothing to do with one's desert of civil rights. He also says that when you allow civil authority to impose religiosity, their own view of religiosity, it makes those civil authorities your judge of what is religious truth, and that's dangerous to have. Again, we're living in that climate right now, this sort of racially inflamed climate, where we have people who are supposedly experts on racism and stuff, and they can pick out the racists and impose penalties. So Jefferson didn't want thought police out there. The mind is free. And last, as I mentioned, Jefferson appeals to the laws of nature. When he's talking about human rights, he grounds them in the laws of nature. And he literally means laws of the physical universe. In many respects, not only because he believes in that, because he wants to disempower the king. He wants to disempower the notion, the Hobbesian notion, that the king is the divine spokesperson. And Jefferson says, no, each person, he says this so often about religious belief, each person is his own God, as it were. Each person can decide for himself what religious beliefs to entertain. And, and it's not a matter of any governmental authority imposing a view on what's the right religion. So, yeah, in some, I think he's leaning, and his inclination throughout here and elsewhere is to lean towards protecting individuals more so than protecting civil institutions, political civil institutions.
So in the end, it sounds like we have freedom of religion, not freedom from religion.
Well, that's a separate issue. I've argued in the book you have there, What is American Messiah,
Yes.
that that Jefferson, if you read him very, very carefully, he is arguing for religious freedom. Again, this is a separate issue, but he's arguing for religious freedom not because he thinks religious freedom is in itself an unqualified good. Namely, he thinks lack of religious freedom is an unqualified bad thing. In other words, he's not making any sort of commitment to the various religious sects out there being unqualified good things. In fact, he has a lot of bad things to say about religious sectarianism, and I highlight, underscore some of those many of those things in my book. I just think he's arguing from the negative position that lack of freedom of religion is a decidedly bad thing. This is an instance where we're trying to control the minds of American citizens. So,
yes. Oh, well, thank you very much, Dr. Holowchak, for answering our questions today. And ladies and gentlemen, ways to contact Dr. Holowchak would be through his email at mholowchak@hotmail.com and his Facebook page, Thomas Jefferson, Bring Him Home to Monticello, Citizens for Change. And next week we have Jefferson's Natural Aristocracy, Letter to John Adams. We'll have 5 questions on that work of Thomas Jefferson. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'll add before I go, that's a very fascinating letter. The cold correspondence with Adams is fascinating. And in that letter, you get essentially the political differences in that lengthy letter between Adams and Jefferson spelled out quite neatly in a nutshell. So I'm looking forward to doing that one.
Yes. And if you'd like to schedule Dr. Holowchak for a conference at your school or political group or college, you can use these means to contact him. And thank you so much, everyone. Looking forward to next week.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.